Belgrade, 1926. From The Mask of Demetrios by Eric Ambler. Men have learned to distrust their imaginations. It is therefore strange to them when they chance to discover that a world conceived in the imagination, outside experience, does exist in fact. The afternoon which Latimer spent at the Villa Acacius, listening to Vladislav Grodek, he recalls as, in that sense, one of the strangest of his life. In a letter to the Greek Marukakis, which he began that evening, while the whole thing was still fresh in his mind, he placed it on record. Geneva, Saturday. My dear Marukakis, I remember that I promised to write to you to let you know if I discovered anything more about Demetrios. I wonder if you will be surprised as I am that I have actually done so, discovered something, I mean, for I intended to write to you in any case to thank you again for the help you gave me in Sofia. When I left you there, I was bound, you may remember, for Belgrade. Why, then, am I writing from Geneva? I was afraid that you would ask that question. My dear fellow, I wish that I knew the whole answer. I know part of it. The man who employed Demetrios in Belgrade in 1926 lives just outside Geneva. I can even explain how I got into touch with him. I was introduced. But just why I was introduced, and just what the man who introduced us hopes to get out of it, I cannot imagine. I shall, I hope, discover those things eventually. Meanwhile, let me say that if you find this mystery irritating, I find it no less so. Did you ever believe in the existence of the master spy? Until today, I most certainly did not. Now I do. The reason for this is that I have spent the greater part of today talking to one. He is a tall, broad-shouldered man of about 60, with thinning grey hair still tinged with the original straw colour. He has a clear complexion, bright blue eyes, and steady hands. Obviously a man with few vices who has taken good care of himself. He lives in an expensive lakeside villa with 2 servants and a chauffeur for the rolls. No wife in evidence. He looks like a man quietly enjoying the well-earned fruits of a blameless and worthy career. He professes to be engaged, for recreational purposes, in writing a life of St. Stephen. His nationality, I understand, was originally Polish. I may not tell you his name, so I shall call him, in the best spy story tradition, G. G was a master spy. He has retired now, of course, in the same sense that the printer my publisher uses is a master printer. He was an employer of spy labour. His work was mainly, though not entirely, administrative in character. Now, I know that a lot of nonsense is talked and written about spies and espionage, but let me try to put the question to you as G put it to me. He began by quoting Napoleon as saying that in war, the basic element of all successful strategy was surprise. G is, I should say, a confirmed Napoleon quoter. No doubt Napoleon did say that, or something like it. I'm quite sure he wasn't the first military leader to do so. Alexander, Caesar, Genghis Khan, and Frederick of Prussia all had the same idea. In 1918, Foch thought of it too. But to return to G. G says that the experiences of the 1918 conflict showed that in a future war, that sounds so beautifully distant, doesn't it? The mobility and striking power of modern armies and navies and the existence of air forces would render the element of surprise more important than ever. So important, in fact, that it was possible that the people who got in with a surprise attack first might win the war. It was more than ever necessary to guard against surprise, to guard against it, moreover, before the war had started. Now, there are roughly 27 independent states in Europe. Each has an army and an air force, and most have some sort of navy as well. For its own security, each of those armies, air forces and navies must know what each corresponding force in each of the other 26 countries is doing, what its strength is, what its efficiency is, what secret preparations it's making. That means spies, armies of them. In 1926, G was employed by Italy, and in the spring of that year he set up house in Belgrade. Relations between Yugoslavia and Italy were strained at the time. The Italian seizure of Fiume was still as fresh in Yugoslav minds as the bombardment of Corfu. There were rumours, too, not unfounded, as it was learned later in the year, that Mussolini contemplated occupying Albania. Italy, on her side, was suspicious of Yugoslavia. Fiume was held under Yugoslav guns. A Yugoslav Albania alongside the Straits of Otranto was an unthinkable proposition. An independent Albania was tolerable only as long as it was under a predominantly Italian influence. It might be desirable to make certain of things, but the Yugoslavs might put up a fight. Reports from Italian agents in Belgrade indicated that in the event of war, Yugoslavia intended to protect her seaboard by bottling herself up in the Adriatic with minefields laid just north of the Straits of Otranto. I don't know much about these things, but apparently one does not have to lay a couple of 100 miles worth of mines to make a 200 miles wide corridor of sea impassable. One just lays 1 or 2 small fields without letting one's enemy know just where. It is necessary, then, for them to find out the positions of those minefields. That, then, was G's job in Belgrade. Italian agents found out about the minefields. G, the expert spy, was commissioned to do the real work of discovering where they were to be laid, without, a most important point this, without letting the Yugoslavs find out that he had done so. If they did find out, of course, they would promptly change the positions. In the last part of his task, G failed. The reason for his failure was Demetrios. It has always seemed to me that a spy's job must be an extraordinarily difficult one. What I mean is this. If I were sent to Belgrade by the British government with orders to get hold of the details of a secret mine-laying project for the Straits of Otranto, I should not even know where to start. Supposing I knew, as G knew, that the details were recorded by means of markings on the navigational chart of the Straits, very well. How many copies of the chart are kept? I wouldn't know. Where are they kept? I wouldn't know. I might reasonably suppose that at least 1 copy would be kept somewhere in the Ministry of Marine, but the Ministry of Marine is a large place. Moreover, the chart will almost certainly be under lock and key, and even if, as it seems unlikely, I were able to find in which room it is kept and how to get to it, how would I set about obtaining a copy of it without letting the Yugoslavs know that I had done so? When I tell you that within a month of his arrival in Belgrade, G had not only found out where a copy of the chart was kept, but had also made up his mind how he was going to copy that copy without the Yugoslavs knowing, you'll see that he's entitled to describe himself as competent. How did he do it? What ingenious manoeuvre, what subtle trick made it possible? I shall try to break the news gently. Posing as a German, the representative of an optical instrument maker in Dresden, he struck up an acquaintance with a clerk in the submarine defence department, which dealt with submarine nets, booms, mine-laying and mine-sweeping, of the Ministry of Marine. Pitiful, wasn't it? The amazing thing is that he himself regards it as a very astute move. His sense of humour is quite paralysed. When I asked him if he ever read spy stories, he said that he did not, as they always seemed to him very naive. But there's worse to come. He struck up this acquaintance by going to the ministry and asking the doorkeeper to direct him to the Department of Supply, a perfectly normal request for an outsider to make. Having got past the doorkeeper, he stopped someone in a corridor, said that he had been directed to the Submarine Defence Department, and had got lost, and asked to be redirected. Having got to the SD department, he marched in and asked if it was the Department of Supply. They said that it was not, and out he went. He was in there not more than a minute, but in that time he had cast a quick eye over the personnel of the department, or, at all events, those of them he could see. He marked down 3. That evening he waited outside the ministry until the first of them came out. This man he followed home. Having found out his name and as much as he could about him, he repeated the process on succeeding evenings with the other 2. Then he made his choice. It fell on a man named Bulitz. Now, G's actual methods may have lacked subtlety, but there was considerable subtlety in the way he employed them. He himself is quite oblivious of any distinction here. He is not the first successful man to misunderstand the reasons for his own success. G's first piece of subtlety lay in his choice of Bulitz as a tool. Bulitz was a disagreeable, conceited man of between 40 and 50, older than most of his fellow clerks and disliked by them. His wife was 10 years younger than he, dissatisfied and pretty. He suffered from catarrh. He was in the habit of going to a cafe for a drink when he left the ministry for the day, and it was in this cafe that G made his acquaintance by the simple process of asking him for a match, offering him a cigar, and finally buying him a drink. You may imagine that a clerk in a government department dealing with highly confidential matters would naturally tend to be suspicious of cafe acquaintances who try to pump him about his work. G was ready to deal with those suspicions long before they had entered Bulitz's head. The acquaintance ripened. G would be in the cafe every evening when Bulitz entered. They would carry on a desultory conversation. G, as a stranger to Belgrade, would ask Bulitz's advice about this and that. He would pay for Bulitz's drinks. He let Bulitz condescend to him. Sometimes they would play a game of chess. Bulitz would win. At other times they would play 4-pack bezique with other frequenters of the cafe. Then, one evening, G told Bulitz a story. He had been told by a mutual acquaintance, he said, that he, Bulitz, held an important post in the Ministry of Marine. For Bulitz, the mutual acquaintance could have been one of several men with whom they played cards and exchanged opinions, and who were vaguely aware that he worked in the ministry. He frowned and opened his mouth. He was probably about to enter a mock-modest qualification of the adjective important, but G swept on. As chief salesman for a highly respectable firm of optical instrument makers, he was deputed to obtain an order due to be placed by the Ministry of Marine for binoculars. He had submitted his quotation and had hopes of securing the order, but, as Bulitz would know, there was nothing like a friend at court in these affairs. If, therefore, the good and influential Bulitz would bring pressure to bear to see that the Dresden Company secured the order, Bulitz would be in pocket to the tune of 20,000 dinar. To that proposition from Bulitz's point of view, here was he, an insignificant clerk, being flattered by the representative of a great German company, and promised 20,000 dinar for doing precisely nothing. As the quotation has already been submitted, there was nothing to be done there. It would stand its chance with the other quotations. If the Dresden Company secured the order, he would be 20,000 dinar in pocket without having compromised himself in any way. If they lost it, he would lose nothing except the respect of this stupid and misinformed German. G admits that Bulitz did make a half-hearted effort, to be honest. He mumbled something about his not being sure that his influence would help. This G chose to treat as an attempt to increase the bribe. Bulitz protested that no such thought had been in his mind. He was lost. Within 5 minutes, he had agreed. In the days that followed, Bulitz and G became close friends. G ran no risk. Bulitz could not know that no quotation had been submitted by the Dresden Company, as all quotations received by the Department of Supply were confidential until the order was placed. If he were inquisitive enough to make inquiries, he would find, as G had found by previous reference to the official gazette, that quotations for binoculars had actually been asked for by the Department of Supply. G now got to work. Bullets, remember, had to play the part assigned to him by G, the part of an influential official. G furthermore began to make himself very amiable by entertaining Bullets and the pretty but stupid Madame Bullets at expensive restaurants and nightclubs. The pair responded like thirsty plants to rain. Could Bullets be cautious when, having had the best part of a bottle of sweet champagne, he found himself involved in an argument about Italy's overwhelming naval strength and her threat to Yugoslavia's seaboard? It was unlikely. He was a little drunk. His wife was present. For the first time in his dreary life, his judgment was being treated with the deference due to it. Besides, he had his part to play. It would not do to seem to be ignorant of what was going on behind the scenes. He began to brag. He himself had seen the very plans that in operation would immobilize Italy's fleet in the Adriatic. Naturally, he had to be discreet, but... By the end of that evening, G knew that Bullets had access to a copy of the chart. He had also made up his mind that Bullets was going to get that copy for him. He made his plans carefully. Then he looked round for a suitable man to carry them out. He needed a go-between. He found Demetrios. Just how G came to hear of Demetrios is not clear. I fancy that he was anxious not to compromise any of his old associates. One can conceive that his reticence might be understandable. Anyway, Demetrios was recommended to him. I asked in what business the recommender was engaged, but G became vague. It was so very long ago. But he remembered the verbal testimonial which accompanied the recommendation. Demetrios Talat was a Greek-speaking Turk with an effective passport and a reputation for being useful, and at the same time discreet. He was also said to have had experience in financial work of a confidential nature. If one did not happen to know just what he was useful for and the nature of the financial work he had done, one might have supposed that the man under discussion was some sort of accountant. But there is, it seems, a jargon in these affairs. G understood it, and decided that Demetrios was the man for the job in hand. Demetrios arrived in Belgrade 5 days later and presented himself at G's house just off the Knez Militina. G remembers the occasion very well. Demetrios, he says, was a man of medium height who might have been almost any age between 35 and 50. He was actually 37. He was smartly dressed and, but I'd better quote in G's own words, he was chic in an expensive way, and his hair was becoming grey at the sides of his head. He had a sleek, satisfied, confident air, and something about the eyes that I recognized immediately. The man was a pimp. I can always recognize it. Don't ask me how. I have a woman's instinct for these things. So there you have it. Demetrios had prospered. Had there been any more Madame Prevesas, we shall never know. At all events, G detected the pimp in Demetrios, and was not displeased. A pimp, he reasoned, could be relied upon not to fool about with women to the detriment of the business in hand. Also, Demetrios was of pleasing address. I think that I had better quote G again. He could wear his clothes gracefully. Also, he looked intelligent. I was pleased by this, because I didn't care to employ riff-raff from the gutters. Sometimes it was necessary, but I never liked it. They did not always understand my curious temperament. G, you see, was fussy. Demetrios had not wasted his time. He could now speak both German and French with reasonable accuracy. He said, I came as soon as I received your letter. I was busy in Bucharest, but I was glad to get your letter, as I had heard of you. G explained carefully and with circumspection. It didn't do to give too much away to a prospective employee, what he wanted done. Demetrios listened unemotionally. When G had finished, he asked how much he was to be paid. 30,000 dinar, said G. 50,000, said Demetrios, and I would prefer to have it in Swiss francs. They compromised on 40,000 to be paid in Swiss francs. Demetrios smiled and shrugged his agreement. It was the man's eyes when he smiled, says G, that first made him distrust his new employee. I found that odd. Could it be there was honour among scoundrels? That G, being the man he was, and knowing, up to a point, the sort of man Demetrios was, would yet need a smile to awaken distrust. Incredible. But there was no doubt that he remembered those eyes very vividly. Prevesa remembered them too, didn't she? Brown, anxious eyes that made you think of a doctor's eyes when he's doing something to you that hurts. That was it, wasn't it? My theory is that it was not until Demetrios smiled that G realized the quality of the man whose services he had bought. He had the appearance of being tame, but when you looked into his brown eyes, you saw that he had none of the feelings that make ordinary men soft, that he was always dangerous. Prevesa again. Did G sense the same thing? He may not have explained it to himself in that way. He's not the sort of man to set much store by feelings, but I think he may have wondered if he had made a mistake in employing Demetrios. Their two minds were not so very dissimilar, and that sort of wolf prefers to hunt alone. At all events, G decided to keep a wary eye on Demetrios. Meanwhile, Bulitz was finding life more pleasant than it had ever been before. He was being entertained at rich places. His wife, warmed by unfamiliar luxury, no longer looked at him with contempt and distaste in her eyes. With the money they saved on the meals provided by the stupid German, she could drink her favourite cognac, and when she drank she became friendly and agreeable. In a week's time, moreover, he might become the possessor of 20,000 dinar. There was a chance. He felt very well, he said one night, and added that cheap food was bad for his catarrh. That was the nearest he came to forgetting to play his part. The order for the binoculars was given to a Czech firm. The official gazette, in which the fact was announced, was published at noon. At 1 minute past noon, G had a copy and was on his way to an engraver, on whose bench lay a half-finished copper die. By 6 o'clock, he was waiting opposite the entrance to the ministry. Soon after 6, Bulitz appeared. He had seen the official gazette. A copy was under his arm. His dejection was visible from where G stood. G began to follow him. Ordinarily, Bulitz would have crossed the road before many minutes had passed to get to his cafe. Tonight he hesitated, and then walked straight on. He was not anxious to meet the man from Dresden. G turned down a side street and hailed a taxi. Within 2 minutes his taxi had made a detour and was approaching Bulitz. Suddenly he signalled to the driver to stop, bounded out on the pavement and embraced Bulitz delightedly. Before the bewildered clerk could protest, he was bundled into the taxi, and G was pouring congratulations and thanks into his ear and pressing a cheque for 20,000 dinar into his hand. "But I thought you'd lost the order," mumbles Bulitz at last. G laughs as if at a huge joke. "Lost it?" And then he understands. "Oh, of course, I forgot to tell you. The quotation was submitted through a Czech subsidiary of ours. Look, does this explain it?" He thrust one of the newly printed cards in Bulitz's hand. "I don't use this card very often. Most people know that these cheques are owned by our company in Dresden." He brushes the matter aside. "But we must have a drink immediately. Driver?" That night they celebrated. His first bewilderment over, Bulitz took full advantage of the situation. He became drunk. He began to brag of the potency of his influence in the ministry until even G, who had every reason for satisfaction, was hard put to it to remain civil. But towards the end of the evening he drew Bulitz aside. Estimates, he said, had been invited for range-finders. Could he, Bulitz, assist? Of course he could. And now Bulitz became cunning. Now that the value of his cooperation had been established, he had a right to expect something on account. G had not anticipated this, but secretly amused, he agreed at once. Bulitz received another cheque. This time it was for 10,000 dinar. The understanding was that he should be paid a further 10,000 when the order was placed with G's employers. Bulitz was now wealthier than he had ever been before. He had 30,000 dinar. 2 evenings later, in the supper room of a fashionable hotel, G introduced him to a Freiherr von Kiesling. The Freiherr von Kiesling's other name was, needless to say, Demetrios. "You would have thought," says G, "that he had been living in such places all his life. For all I know, he may have been doing so. His manner was perfect." When I introduced Bulitz as an important official in the Ministry of Marine, he condescended magnificently. With Madame Bulitz he was superb. He might have been greeting a princess, but I saw the way his fingers moved across the palm of her hand as he bent to kiss the back of it. Demetrios had displayed himself in the supper-room before G had affected to claim acquaintance with him in order to give G time to prepare the ground. The Freiherr, G told the Bulitz after he had drawn their attention to Demetrios, was a very important man. Something of a mystery, perhaps, but a very important factor in international big business. He was enormously rich and was believed to control as many as 27 companies. He might be a useful man to know. The Bulitzes were enchanted to be presented to him. When the Freiherr agreed to drink a glass of champagne at their table, they felt themselves honoured indeed. In their halting German, they strove to make themselves agreeable. This, Bulitz must have felt, was what he had been waiting for all his life. At last he was in touch with the people who counted, the real people, the people who made men and broke them, the people who might make him. Perhaps he saw himself a director of one of the Freiherr's companies, with a fine house and others dependent on him, loyal servants who would respect him as a man as well as a master. When the next morning he went to his stool in the ministry, there must have been joy in his heart, joy made all the sweeter by the faint misgivings, the slight prickings of conscience, which could so easily be stilled. After all, G had received his money's worth. He, Bulitz, had nothing to lose. Besides, you never knew what might come of it all. Men had taken stranger paths to fortune. The Freiherr had been good enough to say that he would have supper with Herr G and his 2 charming friends 2 evenings later. I questioned G about this. Would it not have been better to have struck while the iron was hot? 2 days gave the Bulitzes time to think. Precisely, was G's reply. Time to think of the good things to come, to prepare themselves for the feast, to dream. He became preternaturally solemn at the thought, and then grinning suddenly quoted Goethe at me. Ach, warum, ihr Götter ist unendlich, alles ähnlich, unser Glück nur. G, you see, lays claim to a sense of humour. That supper was the critical moment for him. Demetrios got to work on Madame. It was such a pleasure to meet such pleasant people as Madame, and of course her husband. She, and her husband naturally, must certainly come and stay with him in Bavaria next month. He preferred it to his Paris house, and Cannes was sometimes chilly in the spring. Madame would enjoy Bavaria, and so, no doubt, would her husband. That was if he could tear himself away from the ministry. Crude, simple stuff, no doubt, but the Bulitzes were crude, simple people. Madame lapped it up with her sweet champagne, while Bulitz became sulky. Then the great moment arrived. The flower girl stopped by the table with her tray of orchids. Demetrios turned round and, selecting the largest and most expensive bloom, handed it with a little flourish to Madame Bulitz, with a request that she accept it as a token of his esteem. Madame would accept it. Demetrios drew out his wallet to pay. The next moment a thick wad of 1,000-dinar notes fell from his breast pocket onto the table. With a word of apology, Demetrios put the money back in his pocket. G, taking his cue, remarked that it was rather a lot of money to carry in one's pocket, and asked if the Freiherr always carried as much. No, he did not. He had won the money at Alessandro's earlier in the evening, and had forgotten to leave it upstairs in his room. Did Madame know Alessandro's? She did not. Both the Bulitzes were silent as the Freiherr talked on. They had never seen so much money before. In the Freiherr's opinion, Alessandro's was the most reliable gambling place in Belgrade. It was your own luck, not the croupier's skill, that mattered at Alessandro's. Personally, he was having a run of luck that evening, this with velvety eyes on Madame, and had won a little more than usual. He hesitated at that point, and then, "As you've never been in the place, I should be delighted if you would accompany me as my guests later." Of course they went, and of course they were expected, and preparations had been made. Demetrios had arranged everything. No roulette. It is difficult to cheat a man at roulette. But there was 30 et 40. The minimum stake was 250 dinar. They had drinks and watched the play for a time. Then G decided that he would play a little. They watched him win twice. Then the Freiherr asked Madame if she would like to play. She looked at her husband. He said apologetically that he had very little money with him. But Demetrios was ready for that. No trouble at all, Herr Bulitz. He personally was well known to Alessandro. Any friend of his could be accommodated. If he should happen to lose a few dinar, Alessandro would take a cheque or a note. The farce went on. Alessandro was summoned and introduced. The situation was explained to him. He raised protesting hands. Any friend of the Freiherr need not even ask such a thing. Besides, he had not yet played. Time to talk of such things if he had a little bad luck. G thinks that if Demetrios had allowed the two to talk to one another for even a moment, they would not have played. 250 dinar was the minimum stake, and not even the possession of 30,000 could overcome their consciousness of the value in terms of food and rent of 250. But Demetrios did not give them a chance to exchange misgivings. Instead, as they were waiting at the table behind G's chair, he murmured to Bulitz that if he, Bulitz, had time, he, the Freiherr, would like to talk business with him over luncheon one day that week. It was beautifully timed. It could, I feel, have meant only one thing to Bulitz. "My dear Bulitz, there really is no need for you to concern yourself over a paltry few hundred dinar. I'm interested in you, and that means that your fortune is made. Please do not disappoint me by showing yourself less important than you seem now." Madame Bulitz began to play. Her first 250 she lost on couleur. The second she won on inverse. Then Demetrios, advising greater caution, suggested that she play à cheval. There was a refait and then a second refait. Ultimately, she lost again. At the end of an hour, the 5,000 dinars worth of chips she had been given had gone. Demetrios, sympathizing with her for her bad luck, pushed across some 500 dinar chips from a pile in front of him and begged that she would play with them for luck. The tortured Bulitz may have had the idea that these were a gift, for he made only the faintest sound of protest. That they had not been a gift he was presently to discover. Madame Bulitz, thoroughly miserable now and becoming a little untidy, played on. She won a little, she lost more. At 2:30, Bulitz signed a promissory note to Alessandro for 12,000 dinar. G bought them a drink. It's easy to picture the scene between the Bulitzes when at last they were alone. The recriminations, the tears, the interminable arguments, only too easy. Yet, bad as things were, the gloom was not unrelieved, for Bulitz was to lunch the following day with the Freiherr, and they were to talk business. They did talk business. Demetrios had been told to be encouraging, no doubt he was. Hints of big deals afoot, of opportunities for making fabulous sums for those who were in the know, talk of castles in Bavaria. It would all be there. Bulitz had only to listen and let his heart beat faster. What did 12,000 dinar matter? You had to think in millions. All the same, it was Demetrios who raised the subject of his guest's debt to Alessandro. He supposed that Bulitz would be going along that very night to settle it. He personally would be playing again. One could not, after all, win so much without giving Alessandro a chance to lose some more. Supposing that they went along together, just the two of them. Women were bad gamblers. When they met that night, Bullitz had nearly 35,000 dinar in his pocket. He must have added his savings to G's 30,000. When Demetrios reported to G in the early hours of the following morning, he said that Bullitz had, in spite of Alessandro's protests, insisted on redeeming his promissory note before he started to play. "I pay my debts," he told Demetrios proudly. The balance of the money he spent with a flourish on 500 dinar chips. Tonight he was going to make a killing. He refused to drink. He meant to keep a cool head. G grinned at this, and perhaps he was wise to do so. Pity is sometimes too uncomfortable, and I do find Bullitz pitiable. You may say that he was a weak fool. So he was. But Providence is never quite as calculating as were G and Demetrios. It may bludgeon away at a man, but it never feels between his ribs with a knife. Bullitz had no chance. They understood him, and used their understanding with devilish skill. With the cards as neatly stacked against me as they were against him, I should perhaps be no less foolish. It's a comfort to me to believe that the occasion is unlikely to arise. Inevitably he lost. He began to play with just over 40 chips. It took him 2 hours of winning and losing to get rid of them. Then, quite calmly, he took another 20 on credit. He said that his luck must change. The poor wretch did not even suspect that he might be being cheated. Why should he suspect? The Freiherr was losing even more than he was. He doubled his stakes and survived for 40 minutes. He borrowed again and lost again. He had lost 38,000 dinar more than he had in the world when, white and sweating, he decided to stop. After that, it was plain sailing for Demetrios. The following night, Bullitz returned. They let him win 30,000 back. The third night, he lost another 14,000. On the fourth night, when he was about 25,000 in debt, Alessandro asked for his money. It's promised to redeem his notes within a week. The first person to whom he went for help was G. G was sympathetic. 25,000 was a lot of money, wasn't it? Of course, any money he used in connection with his orders was his employer's, and he was not empowered to do what he liked with it. But he himself could spare 250 for a few days, if it were any help. He would have liked to do more, but Bullitz took the 250. With it, G gave him a word of advice. The Freiherr was the man to get him out of his difficulty. He never lent money. With him it was a question of principle, he believed, but he had a reputation for helping his friends by putting them in the way of earning quite substantial sums. Why not have a talk with him? The talk between Bullitz and Demetrios took place after a dinner for which Bullitz paid, and in the Freiherr's hotel sitting room. G was out of sight in the adjoining bedroom. When Bullitz at last got to the point, he asked about Alessandro. Would he insist on his money? What would happen if he were not paid? Demetrios affected surprise. There was no question, he hoped, of Alessandro's not being paid. After all, it was on his personal recommendation that Alessandro had given him credit in the first place. He would not like there to be any unpleasantness. What sort of unpleasantness? Well, Alessandro held the promissory notes and could take the matter to the police. He hoped sincerely that that would not happen. Bullitz was hoping so too. Now he had everything to lose, including his post at the ministry. It might even come out that he had taken money from G. That might even mean prison. Would they believe that he had done nothing in return for those 30,000 dinar? It was madness to expect him to do so. His only chance was to get the money from the Freiherr somehow. To his pleas for a loan, Demetrios shook his head. No, that would simply make matters worse, for then he would owe the money to a friend instead of to an enemy. Besides, it was a matter of principle with him. At the same time, he wanted to help. There was just one way, but would Herr Bullitz feel disposed to take it? That was the question. He scarcely liked to mention the matter, but since Herr Bullitz pressed him, He knew of certain persons who were interested in obtaining some information from the Ministry of Marine that could not be obtained through the usual channels. They could probably be persuaded to pay as much as 50,000 dinar for this information if they could rely upon its being accurate. G said that he attributed quite a lot of the success of his plan. He deems it successful in the same way that a surgeon deems an operation successful when the patient leaves the operating theatre alive, to his careful use of figures. Every sum from the original 20,000 dinar to the amounts of the successive debts to Alessandro, who was an Italian agent, and the final amount offered by Demetrios was carefully calculated with an eye to its psychological value. That final 50,000, for example, its appeal to Bulitz was twofold. It would pay off his debt and still leave him with nearly as much as he'd had before he met the Freiherr. To the incentive of fear, they added that of greed. But Bulitz did not give in immediately. When he heard exactly what the information was, he became frightened and angry. The anger was dealt with very efficiently by Demetrios. If Bulitz had begun to entertain doubts about the bona fides of the Freiherr, these doubts were now made certainties, for when he shouted, "Dirty spy," the Freiherr's easy charm deserted him. Bulitz was kicked in the abdomen, and then, as he bent forward, retching in the face. Gasping for breath and with pain and bleeding at the mouth, he was flung into a chair, while Demetrios explained coldly that the only risk he ran was in not doing as he was told. His instructions were simple. Bulitz was to get a copy of the chart and bring it to a hotel when he left the ministry the following evening. An hour later, the chart would be returned to him to replace in the morning. That was all. He would be paid when he brought the chart. He was warned of the consequences to himself if he should decide to go to the authorities with his story, reminded of the 50,000 that awaited him, and dismissed. He duly returned the following night with the chart folded in 4 under his coat. Demetrios took the chart into G and returned to keep watch on Bulitz while it was photographed and the negative developed. Apparently Bulitz had nothing to say. When G had finished, he took the money and the chart from Demetrios and went without a word. G says that in the bedroom at that moment, when he heard the door close behind Bulitz, and as he held the negative up to the light, he was feeling very pleased with himself. Expenses had been low, there had been no wasted effort, there had been no tiresome delays. Everybody, even Bulitz, had done well out of the business. It only remained to hope that Bulitz would restore the chart safely. There was really no reason why he should not do so. A very satisfactory affair from every point of view. And then Demetrios came into the room. It was at that moment that G realized that he had made one mistake. "My wages," said Demetrios, and held out his hand. G met his employee's eyes and nodded. He needed a gun and had not got one. "We'll go to my house now," he said, and started towards the door. Demetrios shook his head deliberately. "My wages are in your pocket. Not your wages, only mine." Demetrios produced a revolver. A smile played about his lips. "What I want is in your pocket, mein Herr. Put your hands behind your head." G obeyed. Demetrios walked towards him. G, looking steadily into those brown, anxious eyes, saw that he was in danger. 2 feet in front of him, Demetrios stopped. "Please be careful, mein Herr." The smile disappeared. Demetrios stepped forward suddenly and, jamming his revolver into G's stomach, snatched the negative from G's pocket with his free hand. Then, as suddenly, he stood back. "You may go," he said. G went. Demetrios, in turn, had made his mistake. All that night, men hastily recruited from the criminal cafes scoured Belgrade for Demetrios, but Demetrios had disappeared. G never saw him again. What happened to the negative? Let me give you G's own words. "When the morning came and my men had failed to find him, I knew what I must do. I felt very bitter. After all my careful work, it was most disappointing, but there was nothing else for it. I had known for a week that Demetrios had got in touch with a French agent, The negative would be in that agent's hands by now. I really had no choice. A friend of mine in the German embassy was able to oblige me. The Germans were anxious to please Belgrade at the time. What more natural than they should pass on an item of information interesting to the Yugoslav government? "Do you mean," I said, "that you deliberately arranged for the Yugoslav authorities to be informed of the removal of the chart and of the fact that it had been photographed?" "Unfortunately, it was the only thing I could do. You see, I had to render the chart worthless. It was really very foolish of Dimitrios to let me go, but he was inexperienced. He probably thought that I would blackmail Bulitz into bringing the chart out again, but I realized that I would not be paid very much for bringing in information already in the possession of the French. Besides, my reputation would have suffered. I was very bitter about the whole affair. The only amusing aspect of it was that the French had paid over to Dimitrios half the agreed price for the chart before they discovered that the information on it had been rendered obsolete by my little démarche. What about Bulitz? G pulled a face. Yes, I was sorry about that. I always have felt a certain responsibility towards those who work for me. He was arrested almost at once. There was no doubt as to which of the ministry copies had been used. They were kept rolled in metal cylinders. Bulitz had folded this one to bring it out of the ministry. It was the only one with creases in it. His fingerprints did the rest. Very wisely, he told the authorities all he knew about Dimitrios. As a result, they sent him to prison for life instead of shooting him. I quite expected him to implicate me, but he did not. I was a little surprised. After all, it was I who introduced him to Dimitrios. I wondered at the time whether it was because he was unwilling to face an additional charge of accepting bribes, or because he felt grateful to me for lending him that 250 dinar. Probably he didn't connect me with the business of the chart at all. In any case, I was pleased. I still had work to do in Belgrade, and being wanted by the police, even under another name, might have complicated my life. I have never been able to bring myself to wear disguises. I asked him one more question. Here is his answer. "Oh, yes, I obtained the new charts as soon as they'd been made, in quite a different way, of course. With so much of my money invested in the enterprise, I couldn't return empty-handed. It's always the same. For one reason or another, there are always these delays, these wastages of effort and money. You may say that I was careless in my handling of Dimitrios. That would be unjust. It was a small error of judgment on my part, that's all. I counted on his being like all the other fools in this world, and he's being too greedy. I thought he would wait until he'd had from me the 40,000 dinar due to him before he tried to take the photograph as well. He took me by surprise. That error of judgment cost me a lot of money. It cost Bulitz his liberty. I'm afraid I said it a trifle stuffily, for he frowned. My dear Monsieur Latimer, he retorted, Bulitz was a traitor, and he was rewarded according to his deserts. One cannot sentimentalize over him. In war there are always casualties. Bulitz was very lucky. I would certainly have used him again, and he might ultimately have been shot. As it was, he was sent to prison. For all I know, he is still in prison. I do not wish to seem callous, but I must say that he is better off there. His liberty? Rubbish. He had none to lose. As for his wife, I've no doubt that she's done better for herself. She always gave me the impression of wanting to do so. I don't blame her. He was an objectionable man. I seem to remember that he tended to dribble as he ate. What's more, he was a nuisance. You would have thought, would you not, that on leaving Dimitrios that evening, he would have gone there and then to Alessandro's to pay his debt. He did not do so. When he was arrested late the following day, he still had the 50,000 dinar in his pocket. More waste. It's at times like those, my friend, that one needs one's sense of humour. Well, my dear Maroukakis, that is all. It is, I think, more than enough. For me, wandering among the ghosts of old lies, there is comfort in the thought that you might write to me and tell me that all this was worth finding out. You might. For myself, I begin to wonder. It's such a poor story, isn't it? There's no hero, no heroine, only villains and fools. We shall, I hope, meet again very soon. Croyez en mes meilleurs souvenirs. Charles Latimer. So that was Belgrade, 1926, by Eric Ambler. So let me tell you something about Eric Ambler. He was a British author, born 1909, died 1998. He was best known for his spy and thriller novels. He was born in London. His father was a music hall comedian and his mother was a dressmaker. He went to University College School in London and later studied engineering at London University, but dropped out to pursue a career in writing. Ambler's first job was an advertising copywriter, but he soon turned to writing novels. His first novel, The Dark Frontier, was published in 1936 and was a success. He went on to write several more novels in the 1930s, including Epitaph for a Spy and Cause for Alarm, which established him as a leading writer of spy and thriller fiction. During World War II, Ambler worked for the British War Office and the Ministry of Information, where he used his knowledge of propaganda and psychological warfare to help with the war effort. After the war, he continued to write novels, including Journey into Fear and The Sherma Inheritance, both of which were made into successful films. His writing style was characterized by his attention to detail and his ability to create complex and believable characters. It reminded me a bit of Georges Simenon in this. Yup. So he often incorporated political and social commentary into his novels, and his work was praised for realism. In addition to his novels, he wrote screenplays, including the 1953 film The Cruel Sea, very big film, and the 1960s TV series The Avengers. That was good. He received numerous awards, including the Grandmaster Award from the Mystery Writers of America and the Diamond Dagger Award from the Crime Writers Association in '86. He continued to write and publish novels well into his 80s, and his last novel, The Care of Time, was published in 1981. He was 89 when he died. He's remembered as one of the great writers. So if you think about him as being situated, I'm going to read something from the introduction to this book. Somebody said I talk really fast, as if. Brrr. Anyway, so I'm going to talk slow. I'm going to get you off to sleep. So anyway, this is from an anthology edited by Eric Ambler called To Catch a Spy. It's an old copy. I've got second hand, and it is. I'm looking for a date on it, but 1962. Looks a bit older than that. That might be the copyright. Anyway, so he selects short stories. Now the big problem that the classic form of the spy story is the novel, rather than the short story. So short stories begin with we know all this. We have Sherlock Holmes, and we have Edgar Allan Poe, and they're short story forms. They become later on novels, don't they? And our police procedurals and things are novels these days. Most crime novels are novels, tautologically so. But most crime stories are novels. And so he finds a few, and he wasn't a short story writer, so he included that chapter from The Mask of Demetrios, which I think is actually his most famous book. So as I recall, and I've read it ages ago, the book starts fantastically with the body of this Greek guy. Obviously there were lots of Greek speakers in Turkey in those days before things changed over the 20th century and both sides exchanged population, which was very traumatic for many, many hundreds of thousands of people. But there was a big Greek population there, so it wasn't unusual. There were Greek presses, Greek churches, still are, but much less so. This Latimer guy is trying to hunt him down, and he acts as a journalist, almost an investigator, and he's trying to investigate and find out who Demetrius was. And so he interviews people who've had contact with Demetrius, and we have one of them there, Vladislav Grodek, I think. It's revealed to us, and that's the story. But in itself, you can see this is a complete story, and what he's good at. So spy stories. You think the great masters of the spy story, you do get things like the Bourne Initiative and stuff like that, but to me, the great spy stories are with that moral ambiguity. You can see how they are related to hard-boiled detective fiction. They're morally dubious characters doing shady things, mostly at night, borderline legal. So the spies of our own countries do things kind of legally, either sanctioned by the government, but a lot of what they do is illegal. And so you see that the private eye, of course, the hardboiled private eye is often on the edge of the law. He's got a foot in both camps, so the spy has a foot in both camps, often in the enemy's camp of the spy. So the classic ghost story, the classic spy story is you don't know who to trust. That's the key thing. Usually there's massive amounts of betrayal. That's a real theme of spy stories. People are being betrayed right, left and centre. You don't know who you can trust, who is on your side. And then you get people like Len Dayton, war-weary, tired, spy stories set just after the Second World War. Game, set and match and all those. But I really enjoyed those. And then you have Graham Greene. Graham Greene wrote all kinds of stories, but he'd worked for British intelligence, and so you have things like The Quiet American, Our Man in Havana, The Human Factor, and they're morally ambiguous, and the state, deep state, or whatever you want to call it, is not nice. You cannot trust it. It does not love you, and it's not looking out for you. So, So this is what they're all about. And the other thing I want to say is why Ambler, to me, I mean, he has these characters. Who do we like in that story? Well, there's flashes. We see ourselves in them, I think, in some... Well, I don't know how much you've betrayed, but, we can see our weaknesses and ambiguities. If you were that clerk living that kind of life, and he might be a dribbler, but we all dribbled. Yeah, who's perfect? But his weakness is preyed upon, and he's naive and he's foolish. It goes on all the time. So he was pitiable, I think. I pitied him. And I could imagine, I'm not myself, I've never done anything like that, just to be clear, but you can see his weakness. You could even see the wife's weakness. And G, the Polish spy, master spy, you forgave him a little bit because he was so matter-of-fact about it. He wasn't inhuman, he wasn't a psychopath. He felt a little bit for these people, but he still didn't stop doing it. Maybe he was a psychopath, to be fair, and he was only pretending. But there we are, What I was going to say about the writing is that I was thinking this when I was reading Daphne du Maurier as well. And there are many writers who are good at this, but some are very good. And they torture us. They torture the character. And this is like dramatic irony almost. So dramatic irony is where you know more than the character. So you can see it coming. Think of Oedipus Rex. We know what's coming. He doesn't. In this Bullets rather, we can see it coming. And it is not the fact that he can't see the future. It's his weakness and his greed and his fear. Those great driving emotions, greed and fear. That are exploited all over the world. Everybody exploits our greed and our fear, and his are being exploited. We know how it's going to end. We can see it coming. We know it's being set up for him. So there's that dramatic irony, and I suppose that might be the twist is where we don't see it coming, but the dramatic irony is where we see it coming. It's like watching a train crash in slow motion, and we're like, ooh, It's like those videos that you see on Instagram of people skateboarding, and you know what's going to happen, and then you see the accident, and you're like, ooh, vicarious pain. So yeah, we can see that. So and that is the great. So what I think, just to summarise, really, the great gift of the spy genre to us is moral ambiguity and betrayal, and letting us exist in that. And Ambler's skill in this story is the way he tortures the poor sap, and we see it coming, and we have that dramatic irony, and we do feel, and he, if we didn't care anything for bullets, maybe you didn't, I did, human weakness. We've got to have some empathy for that, or sympathy for that anyway. So this is from the introduction, and I thought it was quite interesting because it situates it within crime fiction. So this is Eric Ambler in the introduction to that anthology, To Catch a Spy, from which I've just taken this story. And he says, the sudden emergence in the 19th century of the detective story has been satisfactorily accounted for by a distinguished American critic, Mr. Howard Haycraft. Having reminded us that crime detection in the modern sense of the term was a 19th century innovation, he goes on, Clearly, there could be no detective stories until there were detectives. The belated arrival of the spy story is less easy to understand. Prostitution may, as we are told, be the oldest profession, but that of the spy cannot be much younger. There seems to have been no period in recorded history when secret agents have not played a part, and sometimes an important part, in political and military affairs. Yet it is impossible to find any spy story of note written before the 19th century. James Fenimore Cooper's The Spy 1821 is mainly concerned with conflicting loyalties during the American War of Independence. It is noteworthy only in that says Ambler, in that it is unreadable. The usual explanation is that until the Dreyfus case, 1894-1899, you may have studied that in history like I did, brought such matters so sensationally to the public's attention, nobody had been much interested in spies or spying, and so I'm trying to slow myself down, and so would not have been interested in stories about them. This seems to me too simple, and in its suggestion that the public cannot be interested in stories about unfamiliar subjects, plainly silly. Mr. Haycraft, obviously feeling the need for a sociological explanation of the phenomenon, suggested it was a logical literary byproduct of the cumulative politico-military stresses of the time. Goodness, that's my goodness there. However, he leaves it at that, and we are left to guess what he means by the word logical and wonder why the considerable politico-military stresses of the Napoleonic era did not produce a similar result. So, it's a very interesting, I'm not going to read all of it because it is lengthy, but it is a very interesting exploration of spy fiction. And I think I'll leave it at that. I hope you've enjoyed that story. It was a spy story, but you can see its relationship with crime stories and particularly the hard-boiled genre, as I've already said. So hope you enjoyed. Spread the word. Let people know about the Classic Detective Stories podcast, and let us grow. All right, thanks. Hope you're enjoying yourselves. Hope you're enjoying the stories. Thank you.